Hey guys, so I've mentioned over and over again that fantasy is my favorite genre, and of course within fantasy you have various different subgenres, and I think the two biggest subgenres within fantasy are pretty much high fantasy and contemporary fantasy, but within contemporary fantasy you have the subgenre of urban fantasy. I think typically people say urban fantasy and mean contemporary fantasy because I actually learned the term urban fantasy before I learned the term contemporary fantasy. And I think those two terms and subgenres are talked about the most because they're basically the complete opposites of each other. If you don't know, high fantasy is a fantasy that takes place in a completely different universe from ours, whereas contemporary fantasy is a fantasy that takes place within our world, so a secret world that kind of exist within our world. And urban fantasy is the most popular within contemporary fantasy. There's so many subgenres happening here, but it's contemporary fantasy that specifically takes place in a city, in a non-magical city like New York City, like Shadowhunters and stuff. So in high fantasy, the fantasy world is completely disconnected, whereas in contemporary fantasy it's basically the same thing. The non-magical people just don't know that there's magic right beside them. So they're basically opposites of each other. I happen to love both, but I feel like there's one big plus to high fantasy and one big plus to I'm probably going to say urban fantasy a lot because I'm just more used to using that term. I think most of the contemporary fantasies I've read have been urban fantasy. I can think of one specific thing about high fantasy that I love that urban fantasy doesn't have, and one specific thing I can think of about urban fantasy that high fantasy doesn't have. With high fantasy, one of my favorite things about high fantasy is the world building. World building is completely one of my favorite things. One of the things I love so much about fantasy is getting to explore a new world and learn about it. And there is world building in urban fantasy, and there are some really great urban fantasy worlds. But it is completely different with high fantasy because you're creating a world not completely from scratch, because you are taking real world experiences. In some ways it's going to be influenced by our world. And obviously there are some common elements among high fantasy worlds that you find a lot and over, like castles, royalty. Because the world building in high fantasy has to be more intense, you don't have to tell every single rule of your world because some is going to be assumed in things. You're basically building a world from scratch. You can do whatever you want as long as you make up rules that help make it make sense. Whereas with urban fantasy, you're working more with our world and don't necessarily have to be as creative. That being said, there's always creativity, and any originality is going to be memorable. So you could totally have an urban fantasy and have it be more creative and more original and more memorable than high fantasy. But in general, I think the world building in high fantasy is a big benefit of high fantasy over urban fantasy because it can just be more kind of immersive and completely take you out of our world, and I find that very exciting, and it's a huge reason why I love high fantasy. But then on the completely opposite side, one of the things that I really love about urban fantasy is that it can feel so real. Because it's taking place in our world, you can get lost in it in a different way than the high fantasy. The high fantasy completely takes you out of our world and immerses you somewhere else. With urban fantasy, you get a sort of this could be real feel that you're not getting with high fantasy because it's very obvious it's not real. It's taking place in a completely different world. Whereas with urban fantasy, if you happen to go to the city it's set in, then you could feel as if you would be in the same setting basically, and you would feel closer to that world even though it was fictional. And I think that that can be a huge draw with urban fantasy that high fantasy doesn't have. While I really do love world building and exploring new worlds, I do think that that sort of sense with urban fantasy does help it feel almost more real but yet fantastical at the same time. And sometimes you want that over high fantasy. And I think that's why I can't choose one over the other. I can't say I like one more than the other. And I do realize that those are basically the definition, like the very thing that makes them different, is what I love about each of them. It makes me unable to choose one over the other. Let me know in the comments below if you prefer either high fantasy or urban fantasy, or if you like them both equally like I do, or if you hate them both, I guess. And I will see you guys later.